number 112 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Agriculture and Agri-Food. This is not your first rodeo, colleagues, so I will not repeat the reminders, but a couple things I do want to highlight. You'll notice that these are a different sound system. These are different microphones than we're used to. I'm told that you need to speak directly into the mic, not over here, not on this side, right into the mic to the extent that you can. Of course, a reminder to keep distance with our translation pieces for the benefit and the health of our translators. So that's what I would say in relation to measures that you need to be aware of. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motions adopted by the committee on Thursday, February 8th, 2024, and on Tuesday, September 24, 2024, the committee is resuming its study of the impact of carbon border adjustments and reciprocity of standards on Canadian agriculture. And we have two full panels today. Really excited to get at this. First, from the Agri-Food Analytics Lab at beautiful Dalhousie University in Nova Scotia, and it looks like Mr. Charbois might be joining us from Nova Scotia. Dr. Sylvain Charbois, who is the Senior Director of Agri-Food Analytics Lab and a professor. From the Canadian Organic Trade Association, Tia Lofsgaard, who is joining us here in person. Thanks for being back, Ms. Lofsgaard, before the committee, and thank you for your work on behalf of the organic sector. And from the International Institute for Sustainable Development, Aaron Cosby, who is a senior associate, joining us by video conference. Great to see you. Thank you for your time today before the committee. Colleagues, you know the drill. We're going to do 5 minutes for opening remarks from each witness, and then we'll turn it over for questions. So I'm going to start with Mr. Charbois for up to 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me again to speak today. Unfortunately, I couldn't make it to Ottawa today. I'm actually in Calgary, Alberta, where the weather is actually nicer than in my hometown of Halifax, by the way. So I'm enjoying the weather here in beautiful Calgary, Alberta. This issue is quite important. Border reciprocity when it comes to trades is critical, especially when our nation is trying to make our world greener through different policies like the carbon tax. It's important to understand exactly how this policy is impacting our agri-foods sector's competitiveness. I've said this before this committee, I think twice already. Instead of looking at retail prices or the retail landscape, it's critical to look at the supply chain and wholesale prices. And if you look at figure 1 that I actually sent to the committee along with my opening remarks, you will see a huge difference in terms of wholesale prices you find here in Canada versus the US. Since 2019, when the carbon tax was implemented, wholesale prices in Canada, food wholesale prices in Canada have actually increased by more than 37% more than in the US, which is significant. In other words, our wholesale prices are now less competitive than prices you find in the US. And that's due to several policies. Of course, it's hard to isolate the impact of the carbon tax as a coefficient, but still, we can speculate that the carbon tax did not help our cause. Since April 2019, Canada's RSPI retail prices index has increased by approximately 32.47%, while wholesale prices in Canada have increased by 42.26%. If you look at figure 2, you'll see that there's basically no gap between wholesale and retail anymore. So wholesale food prices are putting way more pressure on retail, making our food essentially more expensive. Now, again, you could speculate that wholesale prices are pushed up by policies like the carbon tax. In the United States, the pressure from wholesale producer prices, the PPI as they call it, is passed on more directly to consumers with a more immediate reflection of rising costs at the retail level. This suggests that in the US, contrary to Canada, retailers may have more of a buffer or are more inclined to adjust consumer prices in response to producer price increases. So if you look at figure 3 in the document I sent, you'll see that there's a huge difference between the US and Canada. When you think about border reciprocity, you have to look at both landscapes and how they're behaving very differently right now. So In other words, just looking at the data right now, Canada is put at a disadvantage over Canada.
Mr. Speaker,
Cross.
can we have point of order when we're having witness?
Not unless it's in relation to a technical issue. Can you not?
Okay. Well, I was just wondering what study he was talking to.
So I've stopped the clock, Mr. Charbois, and it isn't a point of order, but what he's referencing, Ms. Taylor-Roy, is a document that was sent and distributed to the committee, I believe. Hold on, Mr. Barlow. I'm aware of that. Mr. Charbois, I've stopped the clock. Apologize. So, Ms. Taylor-Roy, I believe it was distributed.
Right. What does it have to do with carbon pricing?
I apologize. It was not distributed. So, Mr. Charbois, I think in linguistic, there was an issue with the linguistic translation. So, we're making sure that we're getting that dealt. So I don't know if all members have referenced exactly to the tables that you're doing, but that's fine, and we'll be able to move forward. Okay. All right. Go ahead, Mr. Charbois. Over to you.
Okay. Apologies to members. I didn't know that you didn't have my notes in front of you, so apologies for that. Essentially, the core of my message is that right now, wholesale prices in the U.S. are moving at a much slower pace than in Canada right now, putting more pressure on retail. And of course, you can speculate that the agri-food sector in Canada is less competitive versus the U.S. So if you are to think about policies to make sure that there is border reciprocity between two nations. I'm just looking at the U.S. right now because the U.S. is so close to us. Of course, you will need to implement tariffs, and that's highly desirable when you think about food security in Canada because tariffs tend to have an impact on inflation domestically. With lower and no federal carbon pricing in the U.S., American food producers are not burdened with the same environmental costs, creating an uneven playing field in the North American market. We often talk about benefits given to farmers and different stakeholders across the supply chain. Even if you provide support, financial support to different stakeholders in the supply chain, you still will see inflation and increasing costs because of the compounding effect throughout the supply chain, making, again, the agri-food sector less competitive overall. The issue is not just about direct financial burdens, but also about the systemic cost increases across energy, transportation, and input supplies, which enhance inflationary pressures across the board. These increases, even when partially mitigated by government programs, still make the Canadian food industry less agile and competitive on the global stage. The carbon tax likely adds a significant cost burden to the Canadian food industry that is not faced by U.S. producers, making Canadian products more expensive and less competitive both domestically and internationally. On that note, I will stop. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Charbois. We'll now turn it over to Ms. Lofsgaard for up to 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and the members of the Standing Committee. Thank you again for inviting the Canada Organic Trade Association to present. We are also called CODA, so if I'm quoting our acronym, you'll know. CODA, we also run the Technical Advisory Committee on Organic Equivalencies to ensure that organic standards align with our trading partners internationally, and it's an honor to share our perspective with you here today. Our mission, of course, is to promote and protect organic practices while fostering a fair and competitive environment for organic trade. Since 2009, organic has emerged as the most recognized and regulated agri-food sustainability claim in Canada. We've established very successful organic equivalency trade arrangements over 35 countries, and we adhere, of course, to the joint FAO and the WHO Food Standards Program for Codex and organically produced foods. Over the past 15 years of being regulated by the federal government, these arrangements have eliminated the need for duplicate organic certifications, resulting in reduced costs for Canadian organic operators, strengthening our trade relations with our key trade partners, and significantly increasing exports and imports of Canadian products. While CODA does not have a formal position on border carbon adjustments, we recognize that various jurisdictions are exploring these measures to promote climate resilience. Canada, we must monitor these actions in order to ensure a fair trading environment for our products and to avoid punitive actions that could undermine the competitiveness and financial stability of our farmers. It's important that any approach adopted consider the diversity of practices in Canadian agriculture. The already regulated nature of the organic sector presents a unique opportunity for Canada to negotiate zero tariffs on organic goods in the event that our trading partners implement BCAs. Given that organic is a regulated claim with established trade arrangements, and that organic practices are defined by standards that reduce carbon emissions, such as using 50% less new reactive nitrogen through the prohibition of most synthetic inputs and promoting careful nutrient management to prevent fertilizer overuse, organic products should be exempt from any BCA tariffs in the global trade arena. In the context of this study, the organic sector exemplifies how reciprocity arrangements can be structured around sustainable agriculture. Even with established reciprocal standards, there is a pressing need for supports to keep our sector competitive. Other regions, notably the EU and the USA, are heavily investing in organic agriculture as part of their climate goals, adopting a carrot approach to encourage sustainable practices and outcomes. In contrast, Canada lacks this explicit policy directives and comprehensive support and funding mechanisms for organic growth, putting us at risk of losing our competitive edge. Each of our trading partners has enacted an Organic Act, which emphasizes and incentivizes market opportunities, rural development benefits, and pathways for small to medium operators to thrive while reaping the environmental benefits of organic production. Canada's regulatory framework must evolve. We've had 15 years of being regulated by the federal government, but we still see an absence of an Organic Act and a cohesive strategy for the sector's growth, which hampers our ability to export and to convert farmers with suitable incentives and training, and to meet that growing demand for organic products, including those beyond the scope of the CFIA's enforcement, which is items like pet food, cosmetics, textiles, and more. To summarize, I have 3 main points. We need to see more regulatory alignment and investment. Ongoing regulatory alignment and market investment in the organic sector are vital. The European Union is the first jurisdiction to amend their organic arrangement into a formal trade agreement, which is happening near the end of this year. As organic trade matures, other countries may follow in adopting formal trade agreements. Canada's organic monitoring systems need improvements to navigate the complexities of trade and maintain the trust of our trade partners. Number 2, we'd like to see the creation of an Organic Act for Canada. We need to prioritize the establishment of an act that has a broader strategy to promote growth of the organic sector. And this act would eliminate existing silos and provide necessary policy direction for the sector to reach its full potential and effectively respond to market demands. Remarkably, Canada is the only major country without a distinct Organic Act. And if our trading partners will implement carbon border adjustment mechanisms, organic products should be exempt. This is my 3rd point. We can leverage existing trade arrangements that demonstrate the reciprocity and equivalency of our organic standards and practices. So with ongoing consultation with the organic sector and other agricultural stakeholders, this is necessary for us to cultivate success. There's strong consensus amongst the agricultural community that federal investments in economic incentives, knowledge transfer, and data are urgently needed. Improved data measurement at the farm level, in addition to organic trade data, are needed to measure the sustainability, outcomes, validity, monitor competitiveness, our risks, our successes within the organic sector. And these investments are essential for supporting farmers, ranchers, and fishers in adopting high resilience, low emissions practices and enabling manufacturers to prioritize organic suppliers over cheap imported organic products. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much. We'll now turn it over to Mr. Cosby for up to 5 minutes, please.
Thanks. I'd like to thank the Standing Committee for this opportunity to intervene on this important subject. My name is Aaron Cosby. I'm trained as an economist, and I'm a senior associate with the International Institute for Sustainable Development based in Winnipeg. I'm also a senior fellow at the European Roundtable on Climate Change and Sustainable Transition. And in both of those capacities, I've done extensive analysis and policy advice around the EU's Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM, and other proposed border carbon adjustment schemes. The EU's CBAM, to put it in context, is part of the EU's broader suite of climate-related policies, the so-called Fit for 55 package. It's meant as an accompaniment to the strengthening of the EU's emissions trading system, its ETS. That's a cap and trade scheme. It limits the GHG greenhouse gas emissions within the Union. And part of the strengthening involved is removing what's known as free allocation of allowances for the covered sectors. That is, while that all sectors have to submit allowances for the GHGs that they emit under the scheme, in some sectors, many of those allowances are provided for free. And these are heavily allocated to emissions-intensive trade-exposed sectors like steel, aluminum, nitrogenous fertilizers, and cement. And the point of that is to avoid what's known as carbon leakage. Just a small side trip to talk about carbon leakage. This is what occurs when climate policies in a jurisdiction like the European Union cause greenhouse gas emissions to rise outside of the European Union. And this can happen because the regulated installations in the EU lose market share to competitors in jurisdictions that don't have a carbon price. Canada has a similar mechanism built into its federal output-based pricing system. It only charges for emissions above a designated sectoral standard and not for all emissions. There's a similar mechanism built into all the provincial level industrial pricing schemes. The point is to keep average cost low while maintaining a high marginal cost that still incentivizes decarbonization. Well, the EU has declared that it will, by 2034, remove all of these free allocations, impose a full carbon price on its producers and ultimately its consumers. As free allocation phases out between now and then, the CBAM is going to phase in. And so the CBAM is an obligation on importers to purchase allowances for each ton of greenhouse gases embodied in the goods that they import at the same price as they would have had to pay had they been produced under the EU's ETS. These changes are going to start in 2026. We're currently in a transition period, but the charges will start in 2026 at very low levels as free allocation gradually reduces, and they'll ramp up to full value by 2034. The EU CBAM covers 5 goods plus electricity, and that's iron and steel, cement, nitrogenous fertilizers, aluminum, and hydrogen. These are sort of like the usual suspect of industrial decarbonization. And they're covered at the level of basic and slightly processed materials. So we're talking not an automobile, but basic iron and steel, rolled tubes, pipes. The emissions are covered are not just direct emissions from the exporter's operations, and those are the so-called Scope 1 emissions, but also emissions embodied in purchased electricity. That's in the case of cement and fertilizers. And importantly, emissions that are bound up in any of the CBAM covered input goods. So if you're a steel pipe producer, you're paying for the emissions in the steel that you purchase. This is important. Agricultural goods are not covered. And that means also that there's no need to declare emissions, for example, embodied in agricultural goods from upstream inputs like nitrogenous fertilizers. There is a commission review due in 2025 that's going to make recommendations about expanding the scope of the CBAM coverage, but it is almost inconceivable that it would recommend covering agricultural goods. Frankly, they're having a hard enough time implementing the regime even for the goods they currently have covered. And more importantly, the CBAM is only going to be charging for goods that are also covered by the EU ETS. That is, the CBAM is a mirror of the EU ETS at the border, and the current ETS does not cover agricultural goods. While the EU does have other policies that may significantly affect Canadian exports, and I think the members of this committee know that as well as anyone, such as the farm to fork regulations and perhaps even the EU deforestation free products regulations and other more long-standing policies, the CBAM does not appear to be an immediate threat to our export of agricultural goods. There are many other CBAM-like initiatives in other jurisdictions. The UK has declared that it's going to impose a CBAM by 2027. Australia is wrapping up its review that may recommend a version there. The US has had at any given point in the last decade 4 or 5 bills before Congress that proposed to put a carbon price on imports of some kind, even though the US doesn't have a domestic price. While it would be prudent for Canadian exporters to carefully monitor these developments, none of them at this point propose to cover agricultural goods. And for me, having covered this for a while, I find it inconceivable that they ever would. So in conclusion, in my view, the EU CBAM is not a particularly threatening policy development from the perspective of Canadian agriculture and agri-foods. Thank you for your attention and look forward to questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cosby. We'll now do exactly that. We'll turn it over to questions. I see Mr. Barlow getting ready. Over to you for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And again, thanks to our witnesses for being here with us today. And I appreciate the testimony of our experts here. And it's clear that, you know, when we had our our department leads here last week, they were also unsure on how this would work, and there was a lot of questioning if this was something that was actually achievable, having a CBAM on agricultural products. And as a matter of fact, Global Affairs has even refused to appear at this committee to talk about this issue, which I think is a testament that our own departments are unprepared for dealing with this. But the government is bringing this forward as a study at this committee when even their own department heads don't seem to be prepared, and one does not want to even appear. But to Mr. Charlebois, when we did ask Finance about the possible implications of imposing a carbon border adjustment in Canada, or looking at doing so, we already know the costs of the carbon tax on Canadian consumers, and even to administer, just from on the government side, is $83 million annually. And when we asked the Finance Department what would be the impact of a carbon border adjustment on how to finance it, administer it, and the impact on the agriculture industry, her answer was it would be intense. Knowing, though, the work that you've done on the impact the carbon tax is having on food prices, and I know this might be difficult to answer, but in your assessment, in your expert opinion, what would be the possible consequences of implementing a carbon border adjustment on Canadian agriculture?
Well, thank you for your question, Mr. Barlow. I would be extremely concerned, given the past record of the government in not measuring anything really related to the agri-food sector. And so we would go in very blindly into something yet again quite new, and that to me would be quite concerning. So on two sides, going out, of course, and I did talk about this, the competitiveness of our industry, I think is being jeopardized by not focusing on competitiveness, by not measuring on the impact of certain policies that we implement, but also for our Canadians. Tariffs will have an impact on competitiveness inside our own border retail. The Americans are having the same conversation right now with their presidential election, because both parties are talking about tariffs. It will be the same in Canada.
Thank you for that. And we have had some questions from our colleagues in the government questioning the validity of your statistics that I saw on your social media the other day, that the carbon price is increasing wholesale food in Canada in every category more than 30%, and food inflation in Canada is about 37% higher than the United States. I just want to confirm with you that those numbers are correct. As a professor at Dalhousie University and a preeminent food expert in Canada, are those numbers that you have stated, are those correct? And the impact the carbon price is having on Canadians is quite significant in a negative way.
Absolutely. So the numbers are correct. The interpretation of those numbers would need to be corrected. So the U.S. numbers are coming from the Federal St. Louis Reserve, and the data in Canada comes from Statistics Canada. But it would be I'd say a little immature to say that the carbon tax is solely responsible for the difference between the two nations. What we're speculating is that perhaps the carbon tax could be a factor, but we don't know for sure and to what extent. So that would need to be clarified.
Thank you very much for that. We saw a news report this morning when I was walking into my office, which I found to be quite surprising, to be honest, is that Canadian doctors are warning their colleagues about the potential of having scurvy once again arrive in Canada, which is not something I ever anticipated I'd have to deal with. But they were saying this is a result of vitamin C deficiency and Canadians not eating enough of healthy food. And again, they attributed that to the high cost of groceries. I think we have to look at every aspect as potentially driving up costs of food for Canadians. We're seeing 2 million Canadians go to food banks. I know this isn't exactly necessarily about a carbon border adjustment, but I think any additional impediment we put on on our agriculture industry, processors, manufacturers is going to have an impact. Are you surprised to see a headline like that, or is this not surprising to you who's followed this closely?
No, I actually read the report, very concerned, but unfortunately not surprised either. We're releasing a report on Thursday about food expenditures in Canada, and retail-wise, food expenditures have remained flat despite higher food prices. This only means that people are avoiding the periphery of the store, where fresh products are, where vitamins, good vitamins and minerals are, including vitamin C. And people will go to the center of the store to escape from inflationary pressures. That's exactly what's happening right now. A lot of families are facing that reality. So the last thing you need to do is to put more pressure on the border to make food even more expensive in Canada.
Thank you, Mr. Barlow. Thank you, Mr. Charbois. Maintenant, Madame Taylor-Roy pour 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here and for being here in person. I'd like to start by making sure that our witnesses understand that this study was initiated to look at what position, competitive position in the Canadian agriculture sector would be in if, in fact, the EU or the United States continue to go in the direction of carbon border adjustment mechanisms and expand to agriculture. Now, we've heard that you don't think that's very likely, and I appreciate that. But I just also wanted to go back to some of the original things that were mentioned in terms of vitamin C, scurvy, and sounds again like a nuclear winter kind of scenario. And when we had another study, I remember somebody coming in saying the increase in the price of, for example, orange juice and oranges or produce was largely due to climate events. That the drought in California, for example, or the romaine lettuce that was diseased, or in Florida, had caused great spikes. And I do recall, Mr. Charlevoix, that you talked very much about the fact that it's price volatility that's the problem. And that seems to be more a factor of droughts and other climate events than it does a regularly scheduled increase in the price on pollution. So I'm very glad to hear you say that you only speculated and there's no proof and that there's a lot of other factors contributing to this. But I would like to ask, in terms of the point of this study, which is the CBAM, the possibility of that. Now, we're not looking at introducing one. We are trying to assess what would be our competitive position if, in fact, other countries put this in place. So given that and what we know about our Canadian agricultural sector, and in particular the organics, do you think that Canada would benefit competitively when we compare Canadian agriculture practices to those around the world, if in fact the EU or the United States were to put in a carbon border adjustment mechanism on agriculture? And perhaps International Institute for Sustainable Development, perhaps you could start.
An excellent question. So in that hypothetical situation, the impact would depend on the relative GHG intensity of Canadian and US or Canadian and EU production. So if Canada, for example, was a lower GHG intense producer of wheat than US producers, we would actually benefit from border carbon adjustment imposed by the US, which would put a price on carbon, presumably also on US production, and impose one on Canadian production. Now, the devil is all in the details. It's unlikely that a U.S. proposal actually would put a price on U.S. Production. So if we're talking a hypothetical charge on all imports entering the U.S., including agricultural goods, obviously we would suffer from that. If we're talking a CBAM-like mechanism, which is a more fair mechanism, which imposes a domestic price, and let's say they imposed a price on their agriculture and mirrored that price at the border, that's what a real border carbon adjustment is supposed to do, then again, it would depend on the relative GHG intensity of Canadian and EU production. I'm not an expert in that area, but I know that EU agriculture is not particularly low-cost agriculture. I don't expect the Canadian, and I know also that the CBAM credits for carbon price paid in the country of export. So Canadian agriculture, in all of the other sectors I've examined that are covered by CBAM, Canada does well. agriculture may be the same. You'd have to do a quantitative analysis to answer authoritatively, though.
Very much, and we've heard and we've seen from Canadian agriculture producers that we've had as witnesses here that the Canadian agriculture sector is indeed one of the most environmentally friendly in many ways, and there's a lot of practices there that could be extended across the board. But I was wondering too, Ms. Losgard, or T, if I could call you that, you were talking about organics, and I'm assuming that in the organic sector, given what you've discussed and the way that organics are already regulated and produced, that the organic sector would do very well compared to the carbon intensity of organics produced in other areas, for example, the United States.
Yeah, I think when it comes to organic products, of course, I think they're unfortunately like a little bit different than other forms of agriculture because they already have the built-in standards that are really focused on low carbon emissions and nitrogen and avoidance of synthetic pesticides, which of course is something that is contributing to some of the carbon issues. So I think this is where what we see happening in other jurisdictions is very progressive policies where they're trying to incentivize organic as one of the solutions. Instead of putting the stick, they're putting the carrot. And so this is where, you know, I think from our perspective, we could imagine that our trade partners would agree that that if they were to do a border carbon adjustment, that organic should not be a part of that element. So, but let's hope for that anyhow.
Right. Thank you very much, and I just want to say thank you for being part of the organics movement. And I know if we are all concerned about our vitamin and our nutrients, that organics have a higher quantity of a lot of that than some of the mass-produced food that doesn't use organics. So I'm sure that would be of interest. And I think, again, we could look at the idea of helping the organic sector more because it will do very well in the future when all the countries are going to be looking at carbon intensity of production and environmental compliance.
To share with the committee after this, there's a new nutrient density study that has come out of the Rodale Institute that is absolutely fascinating, and cutting edge research to actually show the larger amount of nutrients grown in organic food in multiple crops.
Thank you very much. We're at time. Maintenant, Monsieur Parent, 6 minutes. Allez-y, s'il vous plaît.
Floor is yours, Mr. Perron. Well, I want to thank the witnesses for being with us today. My major concern, we've already discussed this in the past, is reciprocity of standards and the sustenance to our local agriculture. How do we support our producers? And they've appeared before us in the past, despite all the efforts they make. When they import carrots from Mexico, we have no clue as to what they may actually contain that are perhaps even banned in the United States, but Mexico still uses them. How can we protect our producers so that we're playing on a level field, that we are working with the same rules without increasing the price of food? Well, thank you very much for the question, Mr. Perron. I'm a supporter of international trade, and we are in agreement with a lot of different countries across the world to ensure perhaps a broader range of agricultural and comestible products. As for the regulations and standards and equivalency, no, of course, Mexico isn't the same as Canada. We know that a lot of Canadian producers will have visited or lived in Mexico or the United States in certain cases. Now, I've always believed that Canadian agriculture is competitive. But right now we're using a lot of penalties rather than offer incentives. I think it's very important to make our agriculture a more ecologically sound sector. But the biggest problem we have is, of course, the affordability of inputs. And we will probably penalize our own consumers. Yes, but, you know, if we don't offer the same conditions to our producers in 5 or 10 years, they won't be around. So you're talking, the carrot rather than the stick. Incentives, whether they're financial incentives or other support. Now, we compared food security and food consumption in the U.S. and Canada, but you even identify, well, we need to have those discussions as well. We need to support, of course, our agricultural sector. We have to make it more competitive. Well, in the current situation, when we were sort of leaving the agriculturalists to do what they can, and they're not under the same rules. Yeah, I agree with you there. Ms. Lafgard, I'd like to understand a bit more what you mean by your three recommendations. An Organics Act. It's already well regulated, but we have standards, and it's not formalized in law, perhaps, but no one's opposed to it. What would that Organic Act contain or cover? What would be its scope?
For the question, it's a great question, and it's something that we've been wanting to engage in for 15 years now. We've been regulated.
I'll just stop you there. I'm going to stop the clock. I'm going to continue to talk in English until Monsieur Parent can hear.
J'ai pas de volume. Tu le montres? Ben oui, mais il était là. OK.
I'm going to keep talking.
Non, mais il fonctionnait tantôt.
Okay.
OK, on reprend.
All right.
Okay.
Over to you, Ms. Lofgard.
So organic, when it first got regulated, it was under the Organic Products Regulation, under the Agriculture Act. And when we got merged with the SFCR, the Safe Food for Canadians regulation, it all became around food safety. And many people said, well, we just didn't know what to do with organic, right? So we put you in there as Part 13. And with other jurisdictions, they've actually created an act that's a standalone act in other jurisdictions that can play on, it not just being the enforcement aspect. It should be around market development. And that is how the United States has positioned organic. It's a market development opportunity for not only because consumers want it, but it's also an opportunity to develop small to medium-sized producers. And it allows for it to be cross-cutting. So right now we kind of get in a silo where there's no policy directive at Agriculture Canada for organic because it's really about just the enforcement side of things. We run into silos, I would say, when it comes to working with Environment Canada, Health Canada, Global Affairs when it comes to organic because there's no real policy directive. So this is where we're looking from some of our trade partners, and I tell you, every single one of our trade partners has a standalone act.
Quand vous dites qu'il n'y a pas de vraie directive, on a quand même les normes, là.
Well, when you say there's no directives, we still have standards. What supplementary standards would you be seeking?
The standards will always remain as incorporated by reference and into the Safe Food for Canadians regulation. It's more about the infrastructure of our government of Canada and the approach that they have. So, for example, I don't even know if this is a good example, but there's a Fertilizer Act, but there's no Organic Act. And the Fertilizer Act actually allows us to be cross-cutting across various forms of different legislation. So this is something I think we should really give some consideration on. It's something that we're going to be coming to speak to our politicians in November 18th. We've requested meetings with many of our MPs to spell out exactly what that would look like, and we're working with somebody who's going to build out the framework.
We're at time. Thank you. We knew we couldn't keep him away for long. Welcome back, Mr. McGregor. Over to you for 6 minutes.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I had to come back to keep an eye on you folks, make sure everything was okay. Thank you to all of our witnesses. This is actually a pretty fascinating study because it seems like we're very much dealing with a hypothetical scenario. Basically, a what-if question is before us. And I do appreciate the three of you for guiding this committee through this study. Maybe I will start with Mr. Cosby. I think it's quite obvious that agriculture occupies a very special place in our economy, and many people recognize that. I think you can even see it, in federal legislation like the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act, which does have exemptions carved out for farming activities, farming machinery, and qualifying farm fuels. And I think you can see that also as a result when the majority of the House of Commons supported a bill like C234, which I think was very much in the spirit of those existing exemptions. I guess what because of the fact that we're dealing with a hypothetical scenario, what I would like to know is, often when we're trying to think up of policy, I don't think there's enough attention paid to the good that agriculture is doing, the good farming practices, because we know that depending on how one farms, it can have a tremendous impact on not only on the emissions, but also on maybe the carbon capture that farm is able to do. So I guess I'd like to have your expertise, like in a hypothetical scenario where we're having these conversations between the EU and Canada, how would the various parties come to an agreement on, say, how we measure the capacity of good agricultural practices to capture carbon? Is there an agreed upon standard that we could? I guess I'd just like to hear your thoughts to guide our committee on those conversations.
I mean, the complexities that you're getting into here are part of or one of the reasons why I don't expect we're going to see agriculture covered by a CBAM-like instrument anytime soon. It's one thing to say, we're going to charge you for every ton embedded in your steel production because we know how much fuel is going in. We know the emissions factors involved in processing. We can pretty much estimate what your greenhouse gas intensity of operations are. It's a completely different thing if we're talking about agriculture as an activity where, as you say, you have soil carbon being either retained or emitted, depending on the differences in practices. You have application of fertilizer, which could, depending on how you apply it, have quite different emission intensity profiles. So, I mean, these are the complications that I think would absolutely look. Let me give you an example of why I don't think that could happen. I know I'm not answering your question directly, but the EU did not include chemicals in the CBAM. Why not? This is a highly emissions-intensive trade-exposed sector. It didn't include chemicals because the downstream value chain in chemicals is insanely complicated. Once you get beyond the 6 basic plastic, everything downstream in there, you have thousands and thousands of products. And moreover, it's difficult to understand how you allocate emissions to all the different products that might come out of a single facility. That complexity made them back off and say, we're not even going to cover it. I think you face the same kind of complexity in the context of agriculture. And moreover, a political unwillingness to subject European agriculture to direct inclusion under the EU ETS. Therefore, no legal route to including it in the CBAM. But if you did that, it would have to be a process of bilateral negotiation between the EU and Canada on how you figure out the emission factors, what assumptions you make in terms of carbon uptake and emissions in each of the different practices. It would have to be a vastly complicated negotiation. There's no straightforward answer to that question.
Thank you for that. Maybe Dr. Charlebois, if you wanted to chime in on it's like, in order for us to make a good policy in these areas, we of course need to have a good data set underpinning it all. And particularly when it comes to the variety of Canada's soils and the different mechanisms that are used with farming. And we are a very regional country. We have very different farming cultures depending on what province you're in. But just anything you can add on that, like the challenge that would exist in trying to sort of frame this discussion between both sides of the Atlantic.
No, absolutely. It's a great question. I firmly agree with Mr. Cosby. I think it would be extremely difficult to measure. But also in Canada, and I've actually mentioned this before this committee many times before, is that there is a huge data deficit in Canada when it comes to agricultural practices. To actually get access to all that data that would be required to negotiate with our trading partners would be extremely challenging. So you would have to collect all that data and then sit at the table with trading partners and come to some sort of an agreement, which would be fairly complex to do and very costly as well. And so I do agree with Mr. Cosby in that that's probably why I don't think that agriculture would be included or covered by a CBAM at all. So I'm fairly confident. I hope I hope we're right, but I do think it would be extremely complicated to move forward with data collection and all the things you would need to properly negotiate.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, it sounds like a great rationale for a national soil strategy. I'll conclude there.
God love you. Okay, go ahead, Ms. Rood, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. We've heard throughout this study about carbon border adjustments that they don't work, they hurt farmers, and if something hurts farmers, it's going to hurt consumers, because at the end of the day, as a farmer, I know what my costs are, and I know that I have to pass those costs on as a to the wholesalers. And Dr. Charlebois, Mr. Charlebois, you talked about the difference in prices between the U.S. and Canada, and I'm just curious, in your opinion, is the carbon tax one of the factors in the differences between the inflation in the U.S. and Canadian food prices?
Thank you for a question. It's hard to answer that question given the fact that we don't have any firm level data, but we do believe that it is a possibility that the carbon tax actually is making our supply chain, our food supply chain, less competitive. Because since 2019, we've seen a dramatic shift between wholesale and retail in Canada. And prices, and you would think perhaps it has to do with a global context, a global economic context, but the United States have been immune to what has happened in Canada. So something different is happening in Canada versus the US. So you would have to look at factors that are different in Canada and the US. And one of them, well, is the carbon tax policy.
Thank you very much. Do you believe a carbon border adjustment measures would further drive up the cost of food? And could you maybe comment on how price pressures are driving Canadians to use food banks right now?
So as soon as you implement tariffs or any barriers at the border, you are eliminating options for consumers. At retail, and of course, wholesale, there could be also complications as well. So it is highly likely that you would push prices higher as a result of a policy like that. Food insecurity in Canada is at 22.9% right now. It's at its highest it's ever been. And it's a problem. A lot of people need help. A lot of people need support. And a lot of people actually can't buy the food that they need to buy at the grocery store right now.
If our standards were aligned with the U.S., because we talk about reciprocity and different food standards, what would that mean for Canadian consumers? Do you believe we'd have access to more foods and perhaps lower prices for food?
Not necessarily, but I am sensitive to the issue of standards. I think it's important that Canada remains an example. I mean, for example, I would say that the work that is being done by organic farmers is a great example. I think we need to support that sector as much as possible and expand it also. So there are things that we can do very well and remain competitive, but at the end of the day, we need to also be cognizant of the fact that we could jeopardize food affordability in Canada when we play with the border, and we've seen that time and time again throughout history.
Thank you. I'll cede the rest of my time to Mr. Steinley.
Yeah, thank you very much. I do have one question for Dr. Charlebois. Good to see you again, Sylvain. He was from Regina at the U of R, so we met many, many years ago when I was a young student at the University of Regina. And as a professor, can you give me an example and think about, I've been trying to figure this out and I haven't, and we're talking about a carbon adjustment or a carbon price, where a tax has decreased the cost of a product. When a tax has been applied to something, is there a rationale why that product would ever go down in price?
You mean a retail tax or a tax at the border or a tariff?
Well, either a tariff or the carbon tax.
I mean, yeah. we have a good example in Canada. It's supply management. I know there are a lot of supporters of supply management in the room, but when you look at U.S. prices versus Canada, we have high tariffs at the border protecting our supply management sectors, and that's a choice we've made. But of course, it really suppresses competition. And so if you look at retail prices in Canada versus the U.S., generally speaking, for poultry, eggs, and milk, prices are much higher in Canada than in the U.S.
Unfortunately, we're out of time, but thank you, Mr. Charbois. Thank you, Mr. Steinley. Monsieur Drouin.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Chair.
Obviously Canada exports more than 50% of what we produce, so we're subject to exports control from other countries. And I think that's why we're having this conversation today is Canada's not necessarily talking about implementing a carbon border adjustment, although G20 countries are talking about it. Canada is having this conversation, but nobody's talking about importing or imposing a CBAM tomorrow morning. My issue is when you analyze the political landscape of what's happening in the EU and understand what happened in December and January and February with the farm movement in there, and my colleague, Monsieur Perron, we call this les clauses de réciprocité here. In the EU, they call them mirror clauses. The largest economy in the EU is pushing the EU to implement CBAM on agricultural products right now. I agree with you that there is no perfect way to measure this right now, but if you're chatting with the folks in the academia sector, they are trying to measure and finding that whether it's in a wet season or a dry season, can we find that delta to how much crops are capturing carbon versus how much are we exposing carbon. I just believe that if we do not take this seriously, we may end up putting our ag sector at a competitive disadvantage. In the U.S., down south right now, we have a presidential candidate who is actively saying 10% tariff on anything. So the world has completely changed from what it was 10 years ago, and that's where I'm trying to take us to. So what does Canada do? Mr. Charlebois, vous avez mentionné, more incentive is perhaps the best way to go. Back in the early late 80s, we said we're going to put a price on CFCs. We got rid of CFCs that were in the refrigerators because two countries got together and said that enough was enough. Carbon tax, whether you agree with it or not, it is the cheapest way to motivate a sector to move to substitute products. Mr. Steinley, that's what economists would say. They both won a Nobel Prize, by the way, just saying. So what does Canada do in 10 years if we're 50% of what we export, they start introducing a CBAM because technology has adapted. It's now easy to measure what we put out as an agricultural output in carbon. What do we do? And I can start with Mr. Charlebois. And I would also ask you if you've actually looked at other jurisdictions and what they're doing and the political landscape as well. Merci. Mr. Charlebois, and after I can go to Mr. Cosby too.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Drouin. I'll be brief so to allow my colleagues to answer your question. So I would say we absolutely need to continue to decarbonize our agri-food economy. There's no doubt in my mind. And of course, we tend to disagree on how to do that. I would prioritize on two initiatives. One, investing in green technologies, and two, measuring carbon capture at the farm level specifically and across the supply chain as well to understand exactly what is happening. The accounting of carbon capture essentially is, in my view, underappreciated. Thank you.
100% agree, but obviously if we do that, then we have effectively found a way to aggregate this data down the line to provide a general number to the world and say this is how much carbon we are capturing or how much carbon we are putting out, right? If we are to participate in a cap and trade, for instance, and companies are investing in ag to say if you plant X amount of whatever and you're capturing X amount of carbon, then therefore you have found an effective way to measure. Right?
Correct.
Okay,
yes.
But we're still working on that. That I understand. Mr. Crosby, up to you.
I would just very quickly agree that it's a no-lose policy to work on the measurement. To my knowledge, and I'm not an expert in this field, the measurement in the science of soil carbon capture and release is not there yet, but it provides a foundation not only for the kinds of things we're talking about here, but for the proper functioning of offset markets that might rely on agricultural soil carbon retention in the future. So that's all good. Let me try one more time to convince you why this isn't a threat, though, if we're talking about the CBAM or carbon adjustment. The CBAM functions by asking individual producers for their data. It's not a national average figure. And that works in the context of steel because we've got about 6 steel mills in Canada, 6 big steel mills, right? How many agricultural producers do we have in Canada? Would you imagine a system that asks each of them to measure at farm level, at the operation level, their carbon intake and their carbon emissions, and then reports on that? And would it make any economic sense for any individual operator to actually participate in a regime like that, or would we just export somewhere else?
Technology is changing that conversation, and that's the point, right? Obviously, we don't want auditors on properties. Obviously, we don't want that. But technology is making that much easier today, and it will make it more easier tomorrow. If you just go to the farm show out in Saskatchewan or Woodstock, you'll see a bunch of companies who are working on that right now.
So we're at time. I gave a little bit extra to let Mr. Cosby. But Monsieur Parent, 2 minutes 30 seconds.
Oui, merci.
Thanks again, Chair. Mr. Charlebois, I can't get over seeing you again because I know that I know what your position on supply management is. So, but you also agree that we are being subsidized, agriculture that is, upstream. So the Canadian consumer is probably paying twice the price of what it actually costs. Those countries that withdrawn from supply management systems have not seen any drop in the price of these products. So, now, am I exaggerating when you say that, or reply? Well, I don't think that we made a choice in Canada. We do offer compensation to agricultural producers, given the various formal trade agreements that have been made. We're talking about billions of dollars. This is compensation. It's not support, it's compensation. It's somewhat hypocritical because we are protecting, but at the same time we have to compensate agricultural producers through the back door because we've signed a free trade agreement with another country, 3 important ones recently. In my opinion, the advice I'd say is let's have one path forward, not 3 or 4. Well, I think Mr. Perron was going there, but I'd like to have Mr. Charlebois also back on track with the subject, that the actual question. Well, okay, it's just a moment. It was Mr. Charlebois' reply, but you have 45 seconds left. Okay, I'm not going to convert this discussion into a debate, but it's something we can't debate in 2 minutes. Mrs. Lasford, I'd like to receive more information as to the details of your 3 recommendations in writing. We don't have the time to actually discuss them all today. I'd like to have a few words with Mr. Cosby. Reciprocity, standards of standards. Do you think it's possible to have completely different systems and allow our Canadian consumers modest-priced food, all the while respecting reciprocity of standards?
The intent of a border carbon adjustment mechanism and all the other similar mechanisms like that are a way to deal with non-reciprocity of standards.
We're going to leave it. Yeah, thank you. We're going to leave it at that. Alistair, take us home here. I might have one question, but go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think I'll save my last spot for Ms. Lofsgaard. I appreciated in your opening statement how you were talking about, the need for Canada to get serious about having its own standalone organic act here. And I know that's something that your organization has been working very hard on. I also appreciated about, how you talked about, some of the advantages. I mean, don't get me wrong, there are challenges for organic farmers, but when it comes to some of the inputs, I know that organic farmers are really trying to lead the way on how they reduce their inputs. And, I think it's an example that is shared amongst the wider agricultural community. But I guess like the question I really want to get down to is, for some countries, in the European Union that have taken a national strategy with respect to organics seriously and are really committed to it. When you put that in the context of where we are at in Canada, and we know that the market and the demand for organics is growing, like what kind of a competitive disadvantage does that leave our organic farmers vis-a-vis those European countries that are taking this very seriously?
Well, I think it was pointed out that we are an exporting nation, and we are Europe's 20th largest exporting partner. So as they develop their own organic capacity, of course, it's going to be less exports, I would say. So unless we can keep our pricing competitive on the export side of things, but I think also we're seeing a lot more cheap imported goods coming into our country. So we're finding people are buying wheat from other jurisdictions, but we're a wheat producing nation. There's something wrong with that system, right? So I think we really need to look at how to make sure that there is going to be a competitive advantage for sourcing Canadian without a supply managed system. And because our sector doesn't even have the ability to apply for a checkoff. We can't even access many of the programs that exist for that already exist with Agriculture Canada. So I think if we can get to that place where we have an Organic Act, we can unveil the funding mechanism that we're in discussions about. We're really looking at how we can have more support from Agriculture Canada on the market development side, but also more transition funding for farmers and extension services.
Thank you very much. Right on time. Just a quick question for me from either to Mr. Cosby or to Mr. Charbois. I think it's interesting because the conversation is premised on if we believe there's something to be done to support the sector in decarbonization or reducing emissions, which I'm not hearing any of the testimony to say that that's not the case. I think the question becomes, how do you go about doing that? And Mr. Charbois, you talked a lot about that, about green incentives, investment from the government, and we're seeing a lot of that in the United States with the IRA. Carbon pricing is one tool. There's other tools. There's regulatory tools. There's government subsidies. All of that comes with a cost, either a cost to the producer, a cost to the national treasury, maybe a cost to the consumer. But then, of course, doing nothing on climate has its own cost. So beyond CBAM, because Mr. Cosby, you've said that you think that's unrealistic, fair, I think that's the fine. Is there ever a way that we're going to be able to reconcile both the competitive advantage that Canadian agriculture already has from an emission intensity perspective in certain goods, or to be able to reconcile countries that are choosing to try to work with industries to reduce emissions that inherently has one of those cost factors? Do you ever account for that, or are we just going to decouple this conversation altogether and really that doesn't come into the fore? That's kind of what I want to get at. And if you have 30 seconds each or 45 seconds each, if not a carbon border adjustment, fine, because it's too complex. Do you see a club system where countries that are actually choosing to do something get together and say, well, we're doing something, whether it's regulatory, subsidization, some form of carbon price, or the countries that are not are subject to a tariff? Or is this just decoupled completely and we never really account for that either competitiveness or the true cost in some form of trying to reduce emissions?
I can take a first shot at that. So, I mean, the G7 initiated, but it's gone beyond the G7 now, a climate club more focused on industrial decarbonization for exactly the reasons you're talking about, for the idea of cooperating among all the willing countries on a number of things, but including something like a mutual agreement on regulatory measures that would raise the cost of production, at least initially, but also would shut out those countries that didn't commit to those kinds of regulatory improvements. And I don't see why you couldn't apply the same principle in the context of agriculture. that climate club is existing and looking for an expanded mandate as we speak. And there's also the industrial decarbonization agenda at the G7. But that kind of a club idea strikes me as the one way you could deal with that. If you weren't talking about prices, if you're talking about prices, then you probably want a border carbon adjustment for Canada. But again, I wouldn't go there with agriculture.
No, I think it's interesting because it's not really around pricing. It's that there's a true cost. If you're the Americans, you're spending a lot of taxpayers' money right now to help reduce emissions. How is that ever accounted for, right? And I take your point about the pricing being too complex to ever do with CBAMs. But Mr. Charlebois, 30 seconds to a minute.
To quickly answer your question, I would say that you cannot make the agri-food sector more competitive unless you decarbonize the sector, but it has to be done in a measurable manner. And you also need to talk about investing in green technologies over time. That's the way I see it. Right now, there's little that is being accounted for. There's little measurement also, and that's a dangerous thing to do.
Beyond the measurement, though, is there a way that you actually account it for in the global economy, or that's just decoupled and we do it out of the goodwill of our hearts?
Unlike Mr. Cosby, I mostly look at our domestic reality more so, and because we do export a lot, and I don't see that changing anytime soon.
Thank you very much. Again, sorry to test the patience of Mr. Steinley for a few extra minutes. I won't do it that often moving forward, Mr. Steinley. Thank you to our witnesses, Mr. Charlebois, Mr. Cosby, and also to Ms. Lofsgaard. Colleagues, don't go far. We're going to transition our next panel. We'll just be a few minutes. Meeting suspended. Thank you to our technological team for turning us around pretty quickly here. But we're going to get right back at it because we've got a busy second panel. From the Canadian Cattle Association, we have Jack Schaff, I think I'm saying that right, Officer at Large, and we have Jennifer Babcock, no stranger. Did I get it right, or Schaaf? Chafe, oh Jesus, I'm sorry, Mr. Chafe, and Jennifer Babcock, Senior Director of Government Relations and Public Affairs. From Cereals Canada, Mark Walker joining us online. Good to see you again, Mr. Walker. And from CropLife Canada, Pierre Patel and Emily Bergeron. Great to see you both as well. I'm going to turn it right over to you. I'm going to start with the Canadian Cattle Association. Over to you for 5 minutes.
Chair, thanks for the opportunity to present here on behalf of the Canadian Cattle Association, or CCA, in your study on carbon border adjustment and impacts to the ag sector. My name is Jack Chafe. I'm an officer at large with CCA. Along with my family, I own and operate a beef feedlot in southern Ontario. I'm joined here today by Jennifer Babcock, Senior Director of Government and Public Affairs. CCA is a national organization representing Canada's 60,000 beef producers. The Canadian beef industry is a significant driver of economic and global leader in sustainability, contributing to $21.8 billion to Canada's GDP in support of approximately 350,000 full-time equivalent jobs. A prosperous and thriving beef industry generates considerably economic, environment, and social opportunities and benefits for Canada. As you may have heard, Canadian beef industry has set ambitious 2030 goals that will drive the future for economic and environmental sustainability. Beef producers are significant positive contributors to Canada's environment and sequestering carbon, conserving biodiversity. We already lead the world in less than half of the global average in greenhouse gas emission intensity, and we're not resting on those laurels. Several of our 2030 goals include a 33% further reduction in greenhouse gas emission, preserving our 1.5 billion tons of carbon sequestered in Canadian grasslands, sequestering additional 3.4 million tons annually, and preserving Canada's remaining 35 million acres of native grassland. When we look at the government programs and policies, we need to look at the whole picture to ensure that we're not in unintendedly consequences. This is where the border carbon adjustments, or BCAs, raise concern with our sector, particularly on trade perspectives. We rise to the protectionist measures around the world and how BCAs impact the global trade dynamics. The Canadian beef sector exports approximately 50% of our production of live cattle and beef around the world. Trade is essential to achieving global food security as well as sustainable development. It's worth noting that the World Trade Organization recently public forum where sustainable as central theme. BCAs and other similar policies were flagged as non-tariff trade barriers. The WTO notes that these types of policies have a negative impact on developing countries. With so much international discussion blending sustainability and trade policy, CCA urges that any domestic sustainability policies, in considering with the WTO's obligations to consider international trade implications before implementing. I'm going to highlight a few of our recommendations focusing on regulation costs to producers and competitiveness. Regulatory harmonization, we continue to seek the further regulatory alignment with trusted partners, implementing of sustainable policies that should add regulatory burdens to producers, but instead look how they align and regular systems and reducing red tape that implements the flow of trade. Additional costs to producers. Producers are price takers. When additional compliance and administration costs are incurred, producers are disproportionately affected, making it more difficult to compete. As new policies are developed, the cost to producers must be addressed. Competitiveness. Canada's currently domestic carbon policies have led to increased costs to producers, which puts us at a competitive disadvantage with producers around the world. We encourage the government to ensure that this is not an unintended impacts global competitiveness and new policies. We urge policymakers to consider potential trade impacts to ag society, which 90% relies on trade. Canada should be proud of beef production across the country. Not only we are leaders in world sustainability practice, but we always are looking for continuous improvement. Canada will naturally be competitive advantage. Now we need to ensure government policies enable us to grow our sector. Thanks, and we'll be looking forward to questions.
Thank you very much. We'll now turn to Mr. Walker, please, for up to 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, members of the committee, thank you for having me here today. My name is Mark Walker. I'm the Vice President of Markets and Trade at Cereals Canada. Cereals Canada is the National Industry Association for wheat, durum, barley, and oats in Canada. We represent the full value chain from farmers to crop development companies, grain handlers, and exporters. Our members are focused on the benefits of export-led growth facilitated by access to diverse global markets. Canadian cereals are a staple food exported to every corner of the globe, over 80 different countries. In an average year, Canada's wheat, durum, barley, and oats sector generates $68.8 billion in economic activity, including more than 370,000 Canadian jobs. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today and provide input into the committee's study regarding border carbon adjustments, or BCAs, as well as reciprocity standards on Canadian agriculture. BCAs are a new and developing area of environmental policy with some certainties and significant uncertainties. At the outset, it's important to note and highlight how a BCA and associated reciprocity might function, but also the structure required to achieve that function. A BCA and associated reciprocity must apply a price on carbon on imported products from jurisdictions that do not have a price on carbon and provide reciprocal relief to entities exporting to jurisdictions that do have a price on carbon. In creating a BCA that would apply to jurisdictions that do not have a price on carbon, the government would have to assign carbon intensities to the harmonized system, or HS codes, of products that are imported into Canada, aligned with the carbon intensity of the life cycle of that product in the exporting country's production system. Some thought would also have to be given to the carbon intensity of comparable domestically produced goods and whether the carbon price assigned to that domestically produced good is higher or lower than the imported good. What this would do would take the work of ECCC's Carbon Markets Bureau and replicate it on a global scale. For example, in order to assign a price on carbon to North African or American fertilizer, the scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions of that product would need to be properly verified. The concept of a reciprocal structure is somewhat more straightforward. However, one must consider exempt jurisdictions with a price on carbon that are subnational, like California, national, like China or the United Kingdom, and supranational, like the EU. This reciprocal structure would need to be spelled out in treaties that seek to avoid double taxation, the kind of which Finance Canada already currently administers. These treaties would provide relief to exporters sending products to markets with a price on carbon and their importers shipping products to Canada. Again, thought would have to be given to the carbon intensity of comparable domestically produced products and whether the price on carbon assigned to that domestically produced good is higher or lower than the imported good when assessing the appropriate quantum of relief. In addition to administering the noted treaty regime, government would need to be properly resourced to collect and refund taxes as necessary. These are the considerations related to a BCA and associated reciprocity. They're well understood. However, there are other considerations that I must flag that, while far less clear, are also critically important. In addition to the significant government resources required to set up and administer this initiative, it would also burden private companies and individuals with new reporting requirements, processes, and costs. It would create an entirely new school of accounting in Canada akin to GST and capital gains. The Canadian cereals industry is export-oriented but reliant on imports of key inputs. A BCA could increase the cost to Canadian farmers on things like imported fertilizer products from some of our largest import sources, specifically North Africa and the US. Furthermore, the carbon intensity of various agriculture inputs varies across the country, whether they be kilowatt hours, BTUs, or fertilizer. This policy runs a significant risk of creating and exacerbating regional discrepancies due to the varied carbon intensity of available products. Over 70% of Canadian cereals are exported around the world. It is unclear what impact associated reciprocity would have on our primary production and domestic end products. Certainly, some domestic consumers of some products would be better off, while some exporters of other end products could be worse off. In seeking to realign economic equilibria from existing government intervention, this policy could in fact exacerbate existing economic disequilibria. I would note the government's efforts through this policy to place value chains on more equal footing with international competitors. However, the outcomes of that effort are far from certain at this time. Given the uncertainty regarding possible outcomes, Cereals Canada would ask that this policy not move forward until its administrative and economic impacts have been comprehensively studied and addressed by government. Thank you for your time. I look forward to any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Walker. We'll now turn over to CropLife. Mr. Patel.
Bonjour, je m'appelle Pierre Patel, je suis le président et chef de...
My name is Pierre Patel, and I'm the CEO of the organization.
Is Emily Bergeron, my colleague from CropLife, Vice President of Chemistry. Thank you very much for inviting us to participate in your study on the impact of carbon border adjustments and reciprocity standards on Canadian agriculture. CropLife Canada is a national trade association representing the manufacturers, developers, and distributors of crop protection products and plant breeding innovations for both the conventional side and the organic side that was here earlier. We advocate for predictable, science-based regulatory environment for both pesticides and plant breeding innovations in Canada and internationally. Furthermore, we champion a regulatory environment that both protects human and environmental safety while encouraging innovation and competitiveness. As a heavily trade-dependent nation, the fifth largest food exporter in the world, in fact, Canada must ensure that protectionist measures are vigorously challenged and that we don't contribute to this trend by imposing measures that, while well-intentioned, could result in further trade restrictive actions by our trading partners. Our regulatory system for crop protection and plant breeding innovations is rigorous and protective of health and the environment. We mustn't let other countries dictate what's in our farmers' toolbox. It could be tempting to call for adoption of unilateral reciprocity measures to create a level playing field for growers. However, the adoption of these measures could result in a race to the bottom, preventing producers from using safe and efficient tools to produce the abundant and affordable food that we need to feed the growing population. Don't get me wrong, we have a lot of work to do on our own domestic regulatory system to be more nimble, to encourage new innovations, and to make sure our farmers are best equipped to deal with the growing pest pressures and increasingly volatile weather. However, in our view, the best way of supporting the competitiveness of the agriculture sector is through increasing regulatory harmonization and cooperation with trusted jurisdictions and promoting the adoption of international safety standards. Turn it over to Emily.
Farmers in Canada and around the world are increasingly faced with the need to produce more food from fewer resources and under less predictable growing conditions. With that in mind, Canada must continue to stand firmly in defense of a science and rule-based trading system for agricultural products. CropLife Canada and our members share the view that others, such as CAFTA, have previously expressed to the committee that sustainability policy and trade-related climate measures must not impose unnecessary regulatory burdens or become non-tariff barriers to trade. En tant qu'industrie,
As an industry, we're concerned with the rise in protectionism that we're seeing around the world. One particular concern is the mirror clause or reciprocity clause, which Europe is using to impose unjustified new barriers to agricultural trade. For example, Europe recently adopted new measures on pesticide residues under the pretext of creating a level playing field for its producers. This new measure, not based on science, will create unjustified barriers to imports and dictate to producers around the world what practices and tools they can use if they wish to export to Europe. Not only does this type of measure have an impact on producers' ability to respond to agronomic challenges they face in the fields, it also prevents them from using safe, effective, and innovative tools to be more productive and competitive. We believe that Canada must play a leading role internationally in defending rules-based multilateral trading systems and the interests of Canadian producers. As an export-oriented sector, we need our government to be at the forefront of international effects to denounce the use of unilateral measures inspired by the mirror clause and to ensure that sustainable development policies facilitate trade and comply with WTO rules.
The agriculture industry produce some of the most sustainable, high-quality crops and food in the world. And as others have previously testified, there is clearly a need for government and industry to develop solutions that will continue to improve agriculture sustainability while promoting trade and supporting food affordability. Canadian growers rely on access to the latest innovative tools, including pesticide and crop developed through modern biotechnology, to meet the food and feed needs of Canadians and the world, and to improve agricultural sustainability. They also rely on a strong multilateral rule-based trading system that support their competitiveness and allow for achieving greater sustainability outcomes. Thank you once again for inviting CropLife Canada to participate, and we look forward to your questions.
Merci beaucoup, Madame Bergeron, pour votre présentation.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Mr. Barlow, you have 6 minutes.
I'm going to start with the Canadian Cattle Association. And you had mentioned your concerns as a CBAM being a non-tariff trade barrier. And I have to say I share your concerns in that we have already seen the impact of these non-tariff trade barriers, hormones, carcass washing, and certainly to see the impact that's had on Canadian beef and pork exports into the EU. And my colleagues are wanting to say that, well, this will be a benefit to Canadian agriculture because our benchmarks are so much better than the EU, which is true. However, the EU is still finding a number of ways to block our products from getting into the EU. I look at those issues, and now with the new deforestation policy that the EU is trying to implement, maybe from your perspective, do you see this as yet another non-tariff trade barrier that the EU is putting on not just Canadian, but probably other jurisdictions?
Yeah, we absolutely see this as a potential non-tariff trade barrier, and it's not just between Canada and Europe, but a few weeks ago we were at the WTO's public forum, and where sustainability and trade was a focus of that forum. There were multiple concerns and member states raising on border carbon adjustments and how this will be seen as a barrier to trade around the world, and at a time when we are also having the discussion of global food security. We need to be able to have more export opportunities and not be putting up barriers. And from our perspective, Canadian beef, we have our trusted trading partners, and we need to ensure that we're not doing anything to negatively impact those relationships as well.
Maybe, Mr. Patel, you wanted to add, and I think that's an excellent point, is that we here around this table always talk about food security, but it's not just about Canadian food security, it's global food security. And if other countries, including the EU, don't understand that they have to rely on Canadian imports to feed their population, and if they continue to do these types of policy, that is going to have a massive impact on food security globally. But maybe, Mr. Patel, you could comment on that as well in terms of this being potentially a non-tariff trade barrier, as you've already talked about the costs that your members are facing when it comes to the carbon tax, higher input costs, fertilizer costs. This could just, again, make us additionally uncompetitive and limit our access to those markets.
Yeah, I mean, we've got a robust system to approve products, and if a region like Europe decides to remove tools from their own farmers' toolbox for quite often political reasons, I'll say it, then why should Canadian farmers then suddenly lose access to those same tools to combat very real pest pressures that they have here, and to grow sustainably and be able to rotate their chemistry and to do the right things agronomically? And that's what we're facing, is that if we go down this path of reciprocity on crop protection, it'll just be, you'll end up with just a handful of products approved globally that farmers can use, and then all the problems that brings. And so, I often say, when Europeans travel in Canada, they don't bring their own bag lunch. They eat our food confidently, and we do the same when we travel there. And so we have to be realistic in sort of the standards that we're imposing, and accept that there are different approaches in different regions.
Thank you, Mr. Patel. And maybe to Mark, Mr. Walker, and maybe to the group, is this will be in pivot. The pivot to this will be our ability to talk about what Canadian agriculture can do. But there's a current bill, C-59, which we call the greenwashing bill, which I think was aimed at the energy sector, still wrongly aimed, but clearly agriculture would fall under this. This would impede your ability to even talk about what we're doing as Canadian agriculture to then access these other markets through a CBAM. It seems quite nonsensical if we are talking about the impact on Canada to have a CBAM, but we're not allowed to talk about it as a result of this greenwashing bill. Maybe, Mr. Walker, can you comment on the implications of that? As I have seen many of these stakeholders now wiping their websites clean of their incredible achievements because they're worried about the liability.
Thank you for the question. Mr. Speaker, Bill C-59 received royal assent this summer. It did contain greenwashing provisions amending the Competition Act. Look, we know Canadian agriculture is sustainable. We know we sequester more carbon than our international competitors. We know we use fertilizer, water, pesticides efficiently, and that we're low carbon. What these amendments do, absent clarification from government on the intended purpose, is prevent us from sharing our sustainability story, which is unfortunately also caught up in the possible development of a CBA. The absence of clarity on what an international standard in a CBA could absolutely prevent this initiative from moving forward due to recent amendments to the Competition Act.
Mr. Patel or Ms. Babcock, did you want to add to that at all, the impact C-59 is having?
Yeah, we've shared the same sentiment in our submission to the government on that, basically saying that there are serious concerns about unintended consequences, and I think you've outlined them well.
I just quickly add that we also submitted on that and are very concerned about ensuring that we keep our science-based standards in Canada and that we do not follow trends that may be political in other countries. And with C-59, that was one concern of ours. And knowing what are the international standards that we have to follow within this, we've put in our consultation, and there's a lot of lawyers that are now involved in this, as a lot of folks are concerned.
Those old lawyers. My God, I was one before I got
They're
in
the
here.
worst.
Go ahead, Mr. McDonald. 6 minutes.
Thank you to all the witnesses for being here today. And we won't talk about lawyers anymore, Cody. But I guess from my perspective and from this committee, what we're doing here today is trying to delve into a preparation of what could happen. I mean, it's hypothetically at this point in time. We know that there is issues relevant around what the EU is doing. We know that when Donald Trump was last president, what he did right away for steel and aluminum. So we have to be prepared. We know there's greenhouse gas inventory and assessment program in the U.S. that they're utilizing right now. And there are gaps in modeling and data collection, obviously. But, you know, for me, I sit here and I say our farmers across this country in all the different sectors are likely on the leading edge of most farmers around the world. So to me, I say, let's find out and figure out if this could be a benefit to us. We know in the U.S. right now that they're measuring GHG emissions. We heard that when some of us were in the U.S. They were starting that, and that was from congressmen. Some of these people were sitting around that table. And believe me, they're pissed off at the EU for doing what they're doing. But that doesn't say that we sit back on our heels and wait for it to happen. I think right now is the time to dig in and come together, industries, governments, at every level, and try to prepare for it in case it does happen. Because I think it could be an advantage for us. The other side of this is there's lots of talk about carbon credits and how that could eventually help farmers' bottom line on their income balance sheet, per se. So I think there's challenges, obviously, and the discussion is about fair trade and reciprocity, but I think also we need to prepare everybody for this and to be all working on the same page. So I guess, in 2022, the CCA, and I'll go to you guys first, the Canadian Cattlemen Association, you guys issued a release on following meetings in U.S. Mexican counterparts regarding CUSMA.
There was a specific mention of working together in global challenges and mentioned non-tariff barriers faced by some jurisdictions. I'm just wondering if carbon border adjustment mechanisms were part of those discussions.
No, they were not. However, the main focus of those non-tariff barriers was addressed at Europe.
Right. So in Europe itself, like in Mexico wasn't involved at all?
Some of the, as our tri-national meetings, we looked at what are the barriers that we all face similarly in North America, and several of the regulations and policies that were coming forward from Europe are impacting us all, the deforestation regulations being one of them.
Okay. So the other angle that perhaps the reciprocity, and I think Mr. Walker mentioned it, was relevant to the EU is basically stating that if they're going to do this, and they're talking steel and aluminum now, their cement, that's fine. But if they're going to do this, they're going to give back the tariff revenue that is generated at the border on their import back to their industries and sectors, which again will put us on a level playing field for what's going to transpire if they ever get to the agriculture sector. So I guess, Mr. Walker, could you kind of expand on, you mentioned it in your preamble relevant to that. Can you just kind of expand what your thoughts are on it?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. I did ponder putting some sort of assessment of that in my remarks. It's quite challenging given that as an export-oriented industry that exports over 70% of our product, there's a patchwork of countries that do have a price on carbon. There's a significant amount that don't. So it's unclear from our industry's perspective whether or not this would in fact make them whole, be revenue neutral. The costs are myriad and quite opaque at this time, unfortunately. I'm sorry, I don't have a better answer for you.
In reality, we're measuring soil carbon right now, and it's similar to soil fertility. I mean, carbon storage, I mean, when you go into Deloitte and Touche and you start reading about carbon credits, they're actually starting to measure agriculture inputs in regards to what we can pay back to the farmer for carbon credits. So the measurements are starting to build. Someone talked about universities earlier today about that they're starting to test all this. So I guess, I don't think we should run from it. I think we should prepare for it. And I think we're in a very good position in Canada to do that. But, I think this putting our heads in the sand and hoping that these don't become trade barriers and so on and so forth, and it becomes political, because it will become political. It'll become geopolitical if there's going to be an advantage to an industry. I'm talking about geopolitical right now because I'm saying we can get out in front of this and we can have success with it if it happens, hypothetically. But we need to be prepared. Mr. Patel, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I think there's been a lot of non-tariff barriers that were cloaked in doing the right thing, and so that's our caution, not necessarily specifically to carbon border adjustments, but that we've seen many examples of, under the guise of protecting the environment or doing something for their people, they impose these non-tariff barriers, and that has a significant impact on an exporting country like Canada.
Totally agree. Thank you.
Monsieur Parent. Merci, Monsieur le Président. Merci aux témoins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the witnesses for their appearance today. I'd like to begin with Mr. Shafi, you're talking about. Well, we all are familiar with the situation in Europe. We don't have correct access to that market. The quality of the products that we export, we all agree on that. It's excellent quality. But we have to discuss, we have to engage with our foreign partners to see what their intent is. And we could talk about Mexico and fresh fruits and vegetables, but we offer great quality of product. The discussions probably have to take place, perhaps TWO. We have difficulty breaking through the European market, but we also have to defend ourselves from incoming products from Europe. Maybe we'll expand our agreements with Mercosur, for example. And of course, practices used in agriculture and slaughterhouses, for example, are not the same from one country to another. But we have to discuss it. We have to talk about it because we have to get every point of view because otherwise we will fall behind.
With Europe, and part of the problem is if we change some of our processing here in Canada, the guidelines and regulations, then it could force us out of some of the other markets in the world. Like the CETA agreement, that trade agreement was actually devastating to the beef industry. And as a producer, I feel like that the beef industry was a sacrificial lamb in that trade deal, and it's been no benefit to us. But to break through and get some exports into Europe, at this time, we seem like we keep running up against a brick wall. And to change, just circling back, trying to change our regulations and processing to meet their standards could force us out of other markets, which we don't want to.
Oui. C'est pas nécessairement de changer, mais tu sais, dans...
Well, it's not necessarily to change our processes, but we have to change the discussion. We have advantages, even if we're talking about the environment. Maintaining the prairies is a very good advantage. Free-range cattle, not a bad thing. Mr. Patel, I'd like to hear you on the same issue. I get quite annoyed, and I'm sure you may agree with me on this. Not always agree, but on this point, when I see foreign products coming in, and they don't meet our own health and safety sanitary non-tariff barriers, but so what do we do to correct that? Do you think that we can work with the World Trade Organization? Well, or your colleague, yourself or your colleague.
The issue with this reciprocity, and the example I was giving is that Europe wants us to only use products that are approved in... Ça marche pas?
Parce que mon son, il disparaît, là. Faut que je le remonte. Il retombe à zéro tout seul. Je comprends pas pourquoi, là. It's okay nouvelle machine, il faut ajuster ça. OK, allons-y.
So I think, if Canada was to take that same approach, that if we shouldn't import products that are grown using crop protection products that we don't allow here, then Europe does the same thing and doesn't allow us to use products that they've banned in Europe. And then Japan, and so you see the point that after a while you end up with very few products that can ever be used. And the growing conditions in Mexico are very different than they are here. And so that same carrot has a lot, very, very different pest pressures in Mexico than it does here. So maybe they need additional insecticides registered, or their disease pressure, stuff that we don't have here in Canada. So they need those tools that maybe we don't, that we can do without. So that's just one example, but the growing conditions and the pest pressures are very different globally, and we can't put sort of one approach on across countries. I don't know if you have anything to add.
Je pense que tu as couvert la question très bien.
I think you've covered that question very well. We'd like to provide our producers with inputs that they can use and still respect all the standards. Something science-based, and we have to give the tools to our producers. And we also would promote the establishment of international standards, harmonized standards, so that our producers would have access to other markets. And the alignment of regulation as much as possible in order to ensure that producers throughout the world treat with categories of same categories in the same manner.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Welcome to all of the witnesses. Thanks for being here today. Maybe I'll turn to my friends of the Canadian Cattle Association first. In the previous hour, we had a number of people who were experts in economics talking about the challenges that this exists, because it is kind of a hypothetical area. One witness was quite sure that the European Union is nowhere near putting in a carbon border adjustment. But I wanted to sort of flip it, and I was trying to turn the conversation towards how we measure the good that agriculture is doing. And certainly we do suffer from a lack of data, even just in Canada, and I'm sure that problem is magnified several-fold when you're comparing international jurisdictions. I think the Canadian Cattle Association, you have set out some very ambitious goals. I think you've had some great partnerships with organizations like the Nature Conservancy of Canada, and you have shown how Canada's prairies were great because of a symbiotic relationship with large herbivores. And in fact, the grasslands suffered as soon as you started removing that. And so cattle are now compensating for that traditional role that has existed for thousands of years. But when you are looking, like sort of identifying that data, you've set up your ambitious goals about how much carbon you want to sequester and so on. Can you talk a little bit about the challenge that exists when comparing with international jurisdictions? And let's take Brazil as an example, because we know cattle farming in Brazil has sometimes, in many cases, come at the expense of the Amazon rainforest. So in a jurisdiction like Brazil, if you were to put it on par with Canada, would they have to measure, for example, the loss of carbon sequestration that came from the removal of a forest turning into grassland? Have you had conversations with international cattle organizations on how you might be able to set some kind of basic, commonly understood baseline?
Okay, I'll start and Jack will fill in here. And too bad we don't have our scientists along with us here. Within the cattle sector, even within Canada, but globally, it's so diverse, and each landscape has its own benefits and challenges and opportunities that come with it. So when we're looking, I really can't speak to those conversations that you're saying. They're not happening at my level of a conversation. There may be scientists talking between the countries on that and looking into those pieces. But in Canada, what we've looked at is getting the data that we need to do our measurements, and we have the National Beef Sustainability Assessment. That's what we're working on to track our 2030 goals as well, and to see. And I don't think we have. We've worked on data and working with government and industry partners, but there's so much that's still missing there. That there's a lot of benefits that the cattle bring in Canada that we are not able to capture at this moment to be able to showcase just how positive we are for the environment. And one of the challenges when we start talking about border carbon adjustments is when you look with such a tunnel vision on one specific piece, you miss the whole picture of what's all the biodiversity, all the species at risk that come and live on the lands with the cattle. Look at the grasslands, and when you talk about ecosystems globally, the native prairie grasslands is one of the most endangered ecosystems in the world. Cattle are preserving that land. And then there's the carbon sequestration. We are looking, as Jack mentioned in his remarks, further greenhouse gas emissions intensity reduction. So we're doing all of these things. How do we make sure that these are actually captured for on the benefit side of it?
And, with the ambitious goals you've set up for yourselves, and I know consumers increasingly are starting to pay attention to how their food was produced. So do you think that, what you've set up for yourselves, does that still lend yourself a competitive advantage, or is it another challenge to overcome? Are you showcasing that sustainability, and do you think that gives you an advantage over your competitors because consumers are increasingly looking for that in the products that they're buying?
Yeah, I'll add in there. So through our Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, we're seen as world leaders in the global stage, and they look to us to see what we're doing. Maybe back to the grasslands, especially the native grasslands in Western Canada. Part of the reason we've lost some of those is the inequality of government policies on money available for different crop productions compared to livestock. And I'll be quite blunt, like crop insurance. That's one of the reasons why we've lost a lot of grasslands, because it's easy to break that land and grow a crop. And if you don't get a crop, you have crop insurance, which is totally different to livestock production.
And just very quickly, you did talk about C-59 and unintended consequences, and I know the Competition Bureau is trying to sort out like some kind of an interpretation guideline. I mean, we ultimately want to make a recommendation. How is that going, and is there anything that our committee can recommend to further that process along for you?
So we've requested to meet further with the Competition Bureau on this to provide some of our perspectives. One aspect that should be considered by the committee and others is what the legislation seeks out to do is if there is anyone can bring forward a complaint, but what if a certain group wants to keep bringing forward complaints? What's the penalty on doing that and the amount of work that goes into having to defend it, right? Exactly. Okay. That's an aspect that has not really been discussed yet that we'd like to be included in the conversation moving forward as well.
Thank you. We're at time. We'll now turn to the honourable member from Regina Leuven.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Introduction. We had a report that came out last fall about agriculture and climate change mitigation, agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, and it's an independent auditor's report from 2024. And when we're having this hypothetical conversation around carbon border adjustments, one thing that I always wonder is what is our benchmark? Where does our data set start? Like, what are we trying to go down from? And right in the overall message on the first page, it says, despite this, the department had yet to develop a strategy for how it would contribute to Canada's 2030 and 2050 greenhouse gas mitigation and sequestration goals. In absence of any strategy, we found that the department has undertaken some extensive science-based due diligence. So my question now is, we really don't have a mitigation strategy in the Department of Agriculture from the Government of Canada. And Mr. Patel, you said it very well that the road to hell is paved with good intentions, right? So I wonder if you could, each of us, I'm asking all the witnesses, can you unpack some of those good intentions that have resulted in some of these non-tariff trade barriers, which I think this would be the same road we would go down if we go down the carbon border adjustment. So I'd start with Mr. Patel, just some of the examples of what we've done with good intentions that has resulted in us not being able to do some trading with some of our key partners.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's plenty of examples of specific cases where products have been either stopped at the border for sort of a residue or, a canola seed or something, a weed seed that wasn't really there. So that we've seen many examples of barriers being thrown up. For us, it's really the more fundamental things. It's the institutionalizing of basically non-tariff barriers and things like deforestation approach in Europe, the mirror clause that my colleague described. Those are things that would now be embedded in their way of doing business that would basically throw up barriers to any exporter. And so that's what's more of concern. And so Canada, we feel, can play a leadership role globally in terms of enforcing those rules-based trading systems that we've all adhered to and signed on to, and really push that agenda forward.
CCA, would you be able to add some of the issues that you've seen through good intentions that have resulted in us having a lack of ability to get some of our world-class beef around some of the markets?
Yeah, we're trying to. There's probably many more that I can think of if you give me a few hours here. But quickly, one of the first things that came to our minds is the CPTPP is a very progressive trade agreement that has been quite positive for the Canadian beef sector. And when we've lost market in markets for non-tariff reasons, we didn't skip a beat because we had the CPTPP and access to other trading partners. When we saw the announcement that the UK would be the accession of the UK to the CPTPP and the non-tariff barriers that came along with that was very disappointing and frustrating to our sector, because what we've seen in some of the discussions we've had already on the non-tariff barriers with the EU that we're facing, the UK have now taken those as well.
I think you've answered this before, but how much beef have we exported to the EU in the last little while?
Very little to the EU. To the UK, we've exported $0.
And yeah, EU
and
as a whole.
they are importing into Canada.
Yeah, thank you. And just on a side, on another issue, I think this would raise concerns and make it even more difficult for our producers who have been hit by several government policies that have been difficult. Would you have a number of what the carbon tax costs a producer per calf?
Yeah, Jack has that.
So on a feedlot animal, we were at $147 a head. And on a cow-calf operation, it's about $84 per animal.
That's straight out of the pocket of the farmer.
Yeah. And a lot of that is like hidden costs. So for example, I buy wet distillers from ethanol plant, and it has to be trucked in. So that carbon tax is hidden in that trucking cost coming in. So it isn't a line item.
You don't think the carbon rebate would cover that?
No.
Mark, I'd ask you the same question. Kind of some of the
We're at time, unfortunately, Mr. Steinley. You know, look, I gave you an extra 15 seconds. I've already been charitable.
Sorry, Mark. It was good to see you again.
Sorry, Mark, but you can certainly provide that to committee in writing, as you know, or you might get another question on it here. I'm going to start to you, Ms. Murray, if you'd like to start, or Mr. Lewis. I think you guys are splitting time. Go ahead, Mr. Lewis.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks to the witnesses. I'll be splitting my time with Ms. Murray. Appreciate everyone being here. Summing it up by saying we're striving for predictability in a very unpredictable world, and we need to stay on front, working towards sustainable development in agriculture to keep feeding our families, to help feed the world. What we're hearing is we've got one of the most sustainable agriculture sectors in the world, and we got to keep moving forward on that, because other countries now are stepping up, but we need to keep that competitive edge, which is going to help our farmers and help the environment as well. So I'll start with the Canada Cattle Association. In Kitchener-Conestoga, not far from you, cattle farms make up about 35% of the farms, which is a significant part of agriculture in the riding. Farmers in Kitchener-Conestoga and throughout Canada are working hard to boost productivity and do it in a sustainable way. And that sustainability has economic benefits. I believe you said, sir, that we're seen as world leaders in that case. So how important is emission reduction and carbon sequestration and in distinguishing Canadian beef from international competitors, and how can we leverage those benefits?
So as a national beef organization, we want to be recognized as leaders, and we want to base our decisions on science-based decisions, whether it's production or trade. And we try to position ourselves as a solution to climate change.
Start on the on my. I'm not sure how much time I have, so I'll direct one question to each person. Mr. Walker from Cereals Canada. All levels of government need to support ways that our agriculture sector can be both sustainable and resilient at the same time. So, can you tell us how Cereals Canada is addressing sustainability within the cereal grains sector, and also can you say how you're helping your members navigate the complexities of a global trade environment?
Well, thank you for the question. Mr. Chair, in response, look, we know we're lower carbon than our international competitors. We know we sequester more carbon additionally than our international competitors. We do compete internationally. That is part of our competitive advantage, and we're very proud of that. However, because we export more than 70% of our crop each year, and perhaps I'll align a little bit with the study at the committee if I could, we won't be able to realize the benefits of a CBA or potential benefits of a CBA when exporting to a country that does not have a price on carbon.
Thank you. Share my time with Ms. Murray.
and thank you to all of the witnesses for being here today. So I have one specific question to start with for Mr. Chaff from the Canadian Cattle Association. And you had mentioned the 2030 goals for improving sustainability. What could you tell us, share with us, what's the goal for reducing methane, and how much reduction has happened to date since you set that goal?
So I don't have the exact number on our reduction, but a lot of that comes through research and the importance of research in developing new products for productivity, especially in the feedlot industry. If the more efficient we are on the performance of those animals, the less greenhouse gas will be emitted.
Okay, I'm kind of, I think it also ties into the emissions of methane from the cattle as opposed to the product development. So, okay, I mean, if you do have that information of how much methane reduction has happened, you could send it to the committee in writing afterwards.
Yeah, and if I can add in, so the methane is part of our greenhouse gas emissions intensity reduction. So our goal is a 33% further reduction, and we just released our national beef assessment in January. Happy to send that to the committee, which shows that we are tracking towards our goals to meet or surpass our goals. So,
and you're tracking methane as well?
Within that, yes. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. And now, there was one of our guests, I think from Mr. Walker, said, I would request the government not move forward with CBA policy. And I think the whole point of what we're doing here is not that the government's moving forward with a border adjustment policy, but should that be applied by other countries that implicate Canada, will we be ready to respond? And so I'm interested for each of the witnesses to give us your thoughts about what are the top two things that Canada could and should do to be prepared in the case that there might be border adjustment policy, carbon border adjustment applied by other countries on our products.
So we are at time, so this is going to be quick hits like, Coke or Pepsi type stuff. I'm going to start with you, Pierre.
I would say, data is king, so we need more data. I would also say holding other jurisdictions to account on some of the things that I've mentioned previously.
And I would just add, like I said before, science-based decisions. It's got to be based on science.
Mark.
I do apologize for the confusion, Mr. Chair. In my remarks, I highlighted that it not move forward until the administrative and economic impacts have been properly and comprehensively studied. So those would be my two asks. Thank you.
Okay, we're at time, but we're going to go to Monsieur Parent, please.
On va essayer d'aller vite.
Well, I'll try to speed it up a little bit. I have a question for each of the three witnesses. My question I was going to ask earlier, as for the registration and of products, categorization. It's possible we can deal with the EU, the United States. We could do a part of the evaluation here, sometimes in the States, and then we'll have that in common. That's a good idea, do you think?
Regulatory harmonization globally on pesticides through the OECD. There's an OECD working group on pesticides where the data requirements and the standards of risk have all been pretty well harmonized across the OECD countries. So there's been a tremendous work. There's also been direct joint review work done with the US and Canada in particular, where they're sharing the review so that the standards are same, the approaches are the same. So we'd like to see that continued and amplified, but there has been a lot of work done in those areas already, more so in pesticides than probably any other regulated sector.
L'autre question, c'est sur...
On C59, you've all indicated some concerns about that. I haven't looked at the law or the bill in question in detail, but is it not environmental greenwash? I have faith in you. I trust that you're proud of your products, so why should you be shy in defending that? So you have 40 seconds each, I believe, on my time left. Well, there are groups. Even if we're in full respect of the regulations, some groups will say, we'll use that to, get some press coverage, to maintain a controversy of sorts.
Additionally, the how the standards are chosen is really important, and how countries choose to measure. Our goals that we've set and our claims that we have within the Canadian beef sector, we stand 100% behind, and that they are based in science. There are different measurements internationally on how to track these measurements, from emissions to carbon sequestration, et cetera. We need to ensure that there's some alignment there.
Okay, Monsieur Walker, rapidement.
Mr. Walker.
Parts to your question in response. First, there's a reverse onus placed on the organization making the claim when the claim is questioned by an external group. Secondly, as my colleague Ms. Babcock mentioned, there is lack of clarity from the Competition Bureau right now as to what benchmark to an international standard actually means. So we're requesting that clarity, but absent that clarity, we simply can't move forward. Thank you.
Alistair McGregor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Maybe, Mr. Walker, I'll just pick up right where you left off. I've been at this committee long enough to know and to have witnessed the data that agriculture in Canada uses to back up its claims. Like, we've seen it, and I think there is a very high degree of confidence around this table that indeed Canadian agriculture are leaders in sustainability, and you have done the work. And I understand, like, the unintended consequences. I do think Canadian consumers do want industrial and agricultural sectors largely to have their claims backed up, and I understand that you do have some concerns about that. I think, like, in the United States, the Federal Trade Commission also has a few rules. Does any of that apply to agriculture? Like, when you are making claims about the sustainability of Canadian cereals to United States consumers, are there any things that you have to pay attention to in the United States marketplace? And is there anything else that you wanted to add about what you'd like to see this committee recommend in terms of how the Competition Bureau is handling this?
It's quite the question. Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. So there are already provisions within the Competition Act addressing components of what you just noted. So beyond general redundancies that exist with the passage of Bill C-59, I would simply reiterate our existing concerns in addition to its redundancy. However, when it comes to the U.S., of course, there are regulations regarding claims there that must be appropriately measured, and we do see a number of countries globally regulating front of package labeling, different claims that are made, and those are benchmarked to international standards. But again, it's not that anyone at this committee is concerned about the attestation or verifiability. It's simply the lack of clarity within the proposed legislation, within the past legislation. So we're simply requesting that clarity.
Just quickly to the CCA and Cereals Canada, you talked glowingly, and I think we all agree we're proud of the work you've done on environmental sustainability or the carbon intensity on a product basis. I fully agree that actually CBAM or those type of mechanisms are going to be too complex to ever be able to move in that direction, and we do want to have open trading markets. But my open question to you is there any mechanism that we can actually eventually reward Canadian environmental stewardship and build that into the trading economy? Radio silence. Mr. Walker?
My apologies, Mr. Chair. I was unclear as to whom the question was being posed. I think the fewer regulations the more regulations can help pave the way for exports, the happier we are. So really looking to government as a partner in that exercise. And as I mentioned, just making sure that any proposals here are properly studied from an economic and administrative standpoint.
It's an open. I think it's the actual heart of the study right now, and it's complex because we want to have open trading markets. We're expecting industry to be part of the solution and work with them, but there's balance to how long you can do that without having it accounted for at some point. So I think that's actually the core of what we're looking at. But just anything quickly or no?
The only thing I would add is with provinces on different, some provinces have carbon tax, some don't, some have exemptions, carbon credits. It's really going to be difficult to bring the whole nation under one umbrella to develop something. It's going to be really complex unless everybody's on the same page.
That might be the title of the study. It's complex. Mr. Patel, what I'll say is, you know where I stand on opening up and actually allowing for more information to be shared on the expansion of farm tools, but you wanted to weigh in quickly, 30 seconds?
Yeah, I just think that the customer always will have a say, right? So quality, Canadian quality is second to none. So even if you don't have the other metrics that may be looking for, we compete well on quality. So
thank you, colleagues. I have a budget here. You guys are going to approve it. That's for this study. I'm seeing no issues. We'll see you on Thursday, Mr. Barlow will be in the chair, and if necessary, with an assist from our good friend from the block. Okay, we'll see you on Thursday.